Um, well, as you see from your agenda, my name is Jessie Lattig. I'm the Preservation Director at Pasadena Heritage, where I also manage their easement program. Pasadena Heritage has been around, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, which is quite exciting. Local, or a nonprofit in the Pasadena area dedicated to preserving and protecting historic resources, cultural resources as well. And our work includes not only easements, of course, and general advocacy, but also quite a bit of education and walking tours as well. And we do help out our neighboring communities, so that it can run a bit of a regional approach as well. The easement program at Pasadena Heritage, how do I actually advance the slide? Oh, great. Okay, very helpful. The easement program at Pasadena Heritage actually dates back to the early 80s. We had a old commercial corridor that was undergoing some revitalization and was recognized as a financial incentive to assist in some of that, and it has grown since then. Today, I'm going to walk us through just kind of what are the basics. What is a preservation easement? How do you know if a property is eligible to receive an easement? What are some of the incentives to go through that? How an organization like ours, or if you are working with an organization that holds easements, what is involved in the administration of the easement program? And just, I think I've got a couple of examples. All the photos that you see in my presentation today actually are buildings and structures and properties that we hold easements on. Some, of course, are some historic images. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's house, once upon a time, down below, and some of the commercial properties in Old Pasadena that we currently hold easements on. So the easement itself, this is actually a legal agreement, and it is tied to the property deed. It's because it's attached to the deed, it is good forever, in perpetuity. The agreement is between the property owner and a qualified easement receiving organization, and it can only apply to qualified historic properties. I'm going to cover here in a little bit. The easement spells out in very specific language what kind of changes are restricted. And if any changes to the property are proposed, what the kind of review process is to ensure that they are historically appropriate. There are regular inspections. I was talking about management and administration, just to ensure condition and maintenance, and if there are changes going on, to ensure that they are actually carried out and implemented the way they were approved. And you can amend this legal agreement and even in rare cases extinguish it, but this doesn't happen very often, and because it is a legal agreement tied to the deed, actually there's quite a bit of just legal work and recording and attorneys involved in making that happen. So the legal document itself can range anywhere from, let's say, maybe 10 pages upwards. The more complex the agreement is, and then much longer. It exists the kind of standard language starts out with just recitals, explaining that who are the parties that are involved, that they are indeed qualified, that it is indeed a historic property that we're talking about. So really just spelling out the definitions that are consistent throughout the document. It's going to go through and in very specific paragraphs explain what those covenants or those restrictions are, and what still each party involved, what rights they retain. For example, you may not be able to change some of the aesthetics, but you can change the use. And that's something that's going to be explicitly stated in there. The exhibits are attachments at the end of the document. And one of those is just what is the legal property description. The second of those are the protected features, actually spelling out in very specific a list or inventory, if you will, the features that are historic and need to be carefully monitored and restricted from changes. And there may be a couple of other exhibits. Mortgage subordination is one that we're going to get to here in a second. And then this final part of the agreement is the baseline documentation. So at the time the easement is donated, what is actually the condition and what are the features that are existing. This is typically black and white, can be color photography. There are no actual legal definition of what that documentation has to consist of. An interesting example, most recent easement that we accepted was for a house in La Cañada, was one of the earliest Disney animators. And it was someone who was very, very involved in the design of his own home. So in addition to having photographs of the current condition, we're really lucky that we have the original kind of design documents, a lot of correspondence with some of the contractors that were hired to do work. So all kinds of really useful information for us now and in the future, since we know this easement is in perpetuity, all kinds of documentation that we can use to just make decisions and understand change over time. So really helpful part of easement enforcement. So mortgage subordination, in order for the easement to be attached to the deed and impact or have effect on the deed, there's nothing that can call its existence into question or actually extinguish it. If a bank is holding a mortgage on a property, they're the ones who have the lien and actually can take the deed and transfer it. And if there's a mortgage in place and there's a foreclosure and the easement is recorded after that or after the bank's mortgage, the easement would be extinguished when the deed changes hands. So in order to make sure that doesn't happen and ensure that the easement is indeed in perpetuity and not subject or vulnerable to foreclosure, it needs to be recorded above the mortgage. This part of actually going into an easement agreement does require some discussion with banks. There are a number of banks that are unfamiliar with easements, or if they are, their experience has not been good, and they don't actually want to be beholden to the restrictions that are in the easement. They're going to be held to keep this property in good maintenance, for example. That is certainly a risk to them and a burden to them, and they're going to want to change the language so that they are basically not subject to those restrictions. What it involves from our point of view is actually having those discussions and explaining this is something that is in their interest. They actually have a third party that is ensuring that the property is being well maintained and that it is being maintained to historic standards and criteria. And actually that anything that they would be required to do is something that would still need to happen for the property to maintain its historic status, and ideally would help resale as well. I think I've dealt with 4 banks at this point, and in every case, they have finally, and their legal counsel has finally, after 2 or 3 discussions, come to see the light, if you will, and agreed and understood, and no changes to the document or the language were necessary. But there was this learning curve that we had to go through. And finally, since it is a legal document attached to the deed, you actually have to go through the process of having it recorded at the county recorder's office. And of course, they're going to take their fees and their per page price. So it's something else just to keep in mind. Go back. Okay. So the financial incentive to donate an easement is tied to your federal income tax. The IRS, in order for them to be willing to give you that deduction, the tax income tax deduction, they want to make certain that this is actually a legitimate public benefit, and they do that by imposing a handful of criteria. One is that it has to be a national registered designated property. So when we talk about qualifications, this is the first and foremost, most important step is to ensure that the property is national registered designated, not just eligible. It can be an individual property, it can be a contributor to a district, both for that matter. That's neither here nor there. Same thing with the type or use, or if it's a historic landscape, that doesn't come into play. There are some exceptions where an organization like Pasadena Heritage might consider accepting an easement if it is not a National Register designated property. However, at that point, the possible financial incentives through the IRS are not going to be on the table. So I mentioned earlier that the easement is an agreement between the property owner and our organization. So the property owner is going to be designated in the easement as the grantor. And in order to go through the administration, not just the drafting of the easement document, but all of the future monitoring and reviewing of proposed changes, there needs to be an endowment that's going to ensure that anyone doing that work can actually be paid and hold the records, et cetera. And the qualified organization, so the IRS, again, if the third party is going to be responsible for monitoring and enforcing the easement, they want to make sure it is actually a preservation group, someone who knows what they're doing, who understands what the Secretary of Interior standards and the criteria are, best practices. The organization needs to demonstrate somehow that they actually have that qualification and have a preservation theme, focus, mission. You also have to demonstrate that you're not just a one-person preservation organization, that you actually do have the means and the resources, whether it's a ability to archive your materials, keep those records on file and have them available, and also actually follow through and carry out what the restrictions are in the easement. And you need to be a nonprofit. Okay, so some of the benefits of an easement, it's highly flexible because I mentioned in that exhibit where you can write out or outline the protected features, the property owner and the receiving organization can be very, very specific about what is protected and what is not. And that is really helpful for historic properties where maybe a lot of change over time has happened. So the easement is not just a blanket statement, everything on this parcel of property is protected. It's actually saying perhaps there are some ancillary structures that were added later, or a road that was once there and is no longer being used, or there's a footbridge that was again added later. So we're able to really define what kind of historic components of the property are key to maintaining forever and ever, and what actually are some areas that may need to undergo change, or that you can already begin to predict as the neighborhood changes or as different types of uses are introduced. There needs to be some flexibility in order for the property to still be occupied and valuable, but that's not going to compromise the historic integrity. But when I say strong protection, like I said, this is forever. And because it is so specialized, that the protected features are so specific, you can really, in very detailed language, clarify what can and cannot be done without review. Long-term protection in perpetuity is a really long time. In fact, when we typically talk about protection for historic resources and we're thinking about districts or individual designation, rarely do we think that this is something that 100, 200, 300 years from now is still going to be in effect. That's really difficult to comprehend what in perpetuity means, especially in an area, most of our buildings we'll see are around 100 years old, but when it is certainly long-term enough until the laws begin to change and actually influence how these properties and deeds are managed, but long enough that it is going to exceed any municipal laws, county laws that may or may not change with shifting administrations, for example. So a very good, strong long-term protection. And then the financial benefits I mentioned. So the opportunity for a homeowner or property owner rather is that the IRS acknowledges that by restricting the changes to the property, you're actually limiting the development potential. There is a possible and typical difference between the fair market value of that property and how you could change it, and once it's restricted with the easement. So we would call that encumbered. The difference between that encumbered property value and the fair market value, that's called the easement value. The change in value is considered a charitable donation by the IRS. This is truly a gift to the public good. And the IRS is willing to say, okay, given that assumed reduction in the property value due to those restrictions, why don't you take that as a deduction from your federal income taxes? It needs to be itemized and is typically spread out over a period of 5 years. But if you have a highly valuable property, heavy restrictions.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Change too dramatically, that easement value can be pretty high, and therefore your resulting deduction in your income taxes can be also very high. Oh, there you go.
That the difference in the effort amount, does that happen just once at the very beginning of the easement contract?
Yes. The I think I've got the extra on the next slide. I apologize, I didn't realize I had it on this slide here. Let me check really quick. Yeah. Okay, so the before and after method is what I just mentioned. The appraiser needs to make that calculation. So they are looking at the protected features and truly calculating with that restriction, with those restrictions in place, how would that impact the value of the property? And they actually need to have done this in the past and demonstrate that they understand how to make that kind of evaluation. And that is, as you were asking, just one time at the time that the easement is donated. So it only benefits the property owner who donates the easement. There is no other future deduction possible for future owners. That if the property is sold, that would depend on how the assessment goes or appraisal goes at the time of sale, and it's not a given. And in neighborhoods, Pasadena is an example where actually the historic nature or character of a property has a lot of value that can actually either keep the sale price very high, if not higher. Doesn't necessarily reduce it if there are restrictions. I would say it depends on the types of restrictions that are in place and the type of property. Very specific. You know?
The difference between the covered amount and the fair market value, if the property is like in a historic district that wouldn't allow for those changes anyways, how would that make it less the difference between the covered amount and the, because you wouldn't be able to demolish those features anyways. So
well, or well, it depends on where you are, unfortunately, which is why an easement might actually be of interest in places where the local municipality is not so good at enforcing them. I would say La Cañada is, yeah, and it's actually a reason why the La Cañada residents recently came to us and asked about that. Chris? Districts are not, contributors are not. Right. Yeah, that is spot on. So just to come back to this question though about the IRS, they want to make sure that the person who is calculating that difference that you're going to then take as a deduction knows what they're doing, that there's a very clear description of what is specifically being restricted. They want it in writing. Of course, they're going to file a fee as well. So that's one of the two, actually 3 requirements that they have. The other one is that they're actually going to be looking at the property, what is being restricted, is it indeed historic, is it indeed a qualified organization, and they're getting quite strict on this and want to make sure that's not just kind of make-believe Disneyland air that is being fewer taxes are being paid. Caught that, yep. Oh, and then just really, pardon me, quickly, it is compatible with the Mills Act. So, you know, if you're already actually gaining benefits from the Mills Act and what that requirements there for your rehabilitation plan, that can very nicely tie into the easement. In fact, it works really well because the easement is going to ask you to maintain all of these features as well. And here you have this similar requirement. So they tie in very nicely, I would say. However, with the tax credit program, since a project is maybe doing some very large restoration rehabilitation work and taking tax credits, the IRS says, no, 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 you're going to take those credits first, and only after that point can we come and discuss the easement. This gets a little bit more difficult because the IRS is very specific about the period in time in which the appraisal is made and when the deductions are taken. So this is more complicated, but is still nonetheless possible. And truly very attractive for large commercial projects. Cover that. Okay, so that's actually just putting an easement together, if you will, and getting to that point of filing it and taking the deductions for the property owners. When it comes to the actual enforcement of the easement, that's where my organization and the property owners are working hand in hand. So we're going out and actually visiting the sites. We need to let them know ahead of time. So that's something that is spelled out in the easement. For example, the amount of notification they need. We actually have to go out and visit every site. We come up with a report, explain what we've seen, what we've observed, and if there are any issues that come up, explaining how they need to be resolved and giving them a time frame. This is really necessary to prevent or hopefully slow down any deferred maintenance, and in rare occasions, I would say remedy and improve work. This doesn't happen too frequently, thank goodness, but it's certainly not so uncommon. Usually any work that someone has done is hopefully harmless, and we're talking about paint or occasionally a light fixture. But we're seeing, especially in the last couple of years, quite a few property owners who are doing pretty major rehabilitations. We'd like to think that they're saving tons of money on their Mills Act properties and they're investing it. I'm not sure if that's always the case, but it doesn't matter if it's commercial or residential. They're doing some pretty big either roofing work, exterior repairs, occasionally having to actually do some replacement as well. And in that situation, we require a fairly detailed application almost of what is the work that's being proposed to have done. And internally, we have our own review process, using or relying on some of the kind of experts and professionals that volunteer from us, or precedent in other properties where we've seen similar work done. Obviously, applying the Secretary's standards, we have a committee that reviews some of the larger projects, and then we're working kind of in tandem with city officials. So they're more than likely going to require a permit from the city. It's in everyone's best interest if we're doing our review and talking together with the city at the same time, rather than they go to the city, get something approved, come to us, and we say, oh, no, 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 you can't do it that way, you have to do it another way, and they end up having to pay fees to get the permit changed. That doesn't work for anyone. So we're lucky in Pasadena that we have a very good working relationship with the city, and they are actually very familiar and up to date with the properties that we hold easements on, so we can do that kind of review in tandem. Here's an example, the Edison El Rey building in Pasadena, Green and Raymond. Actually, they did a wonderful job, but took some time to actually come to some conclusions. They came to us and said, we're going to repaint, replace some of the windows and put in new storefronts. And we said, oh, great, so excited that you want to invest some money in this building, but if you're going to touch a window, I want to know about it. Here's what a window schedule looks like. This is what I want to know. I want to see some color examples. Let's actually go out and walk the property together with your contractor, and we're going to talk about plaster. We're going to talk about cracks. We're going to talk about what you can and cannot change on the windows. So this is an example where there really is a lot of hand-holding with the property owner, with their either property manager or our contractors. This got turned around, but interesting nonetheless. Here's an example of a house. They wanted to add a second story, small. It's a 1908 bungalow. They wanted to put a second story on there, just a small bedroom, nothing too enormous or egregious, very tastefully designed. They did a great job, but we're looking not only out at the exterior and how is that going to change and make sure that it's compatible, but we want to make sure also that structurally that's actually been well enough designed that the engineering and structural considerations are actually as good quality as the exterior aesthetics and design that they had going on top. And that's where we rely, again, on some of our kind of in-house volunteer structural engineers to make sure the entire project holistically is, again, something that's good for the property going into the future. So just in closing, a little bit of trivia and statistics about our own program. We hold 83 easements. I mentioned that we started the program in the early 80s when Old Pasadena was undergoing major revitalization. So about half of those date from that period. Interesting to see just kind of how protection language alone has changed in those 30, nearly 40 years. So of the 83, 36 are commercial, 37 are residential. What is really interesting, oh, you know, this is just really difficult. Is this adapted? We have a great National Registered District in Marengo where about 18 buildings were taken. They were actually single family homes, and the zoning was changed to mixed use, some light commercial use. So we do have a number of offices. So they're being used as commercial buildings, but they are actually single family residences. This is really interesting when we start to talk about how buildings age and what are some of the regular repairs that are having to be undertaken. So we kind of do our inspections or we're reviewing changes. Commercial businesses, a lot of turnover, right? And they're really heavy traffic areas. So they're going to need really different type of work than the residential. And then when you put that into a residential, then it's a kind of a different approach to the kind of work that is being done and the kind of recommendations that we are making to those property owners. What I think I failed to mention at the beginning when I said you could be very, very tailored and highly flexible is that means that you can include not just the facades of the buildings, but interior features as well, and even some of the landscape and garden design. So of those 83, actually 12 of them do have interiors. This includes, I believe, 5 different green and green properties and a couple of Heinemann's that came up earlier, for example. And we do have 5 historic gardens where it's the topography or the arroyo stone walls that are involved, or a specific pond. I think that came up earlier, for example. So truly, all of these features that contribute to the historic character of the property can be included. And then I was talking about age a little bit earlier. This was just an interesting statistic for us. When we begin to talk about what were the materials that were used, what were the technologies or methods that were used to create them or to manufacture them, how are they aging? I think anybody in this room can appreciate that the work that was being done at the turn of the century was very different than what was happening in the 1930s. And so when you are both creating an easement and also when you are enforcing it, that's something that you have to consider is how are these materials going to age, and who are the experts around who can give you the information about how best to keep them in good repair. And then finally, Pasadena Heritage is not the only group that holds easements. There are several others, including California Preservation Foundation and the National Trust. Work nonetheless. I completely understand. Sometimes I wish I only had 2. The Conservancy, I believe, is up to nearly 35. San Francisco, our neighbors in San Diego. And I'd actually like to say an organization that was very helpful to us about 10 years ago and kind of understanding the future of easements is the L'Enfant Trust in Washington, D.C. You can imagine in D.C. just an incredible concentration of historic properties, and they have, I want to say, hundreds of easements. So if this is something that you're interested in, a great resource that I'd also highly recommend. Okay, that's it for me, but I'm happy to take a couple of other questions. Jennifer. Have you included plant material in the garden easements? No. Oh, the question was if we included plant material. This has not happened yet. I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up. What the closest language that I've seen in the easement that says plantings in substantially similar plantings. And we have interpreted that to mean both size and texture, if you will. And it's very clear, especially in this drought age or era, that we're going to see plantings come and go much quicker. And so long as the setting is not so detrimentally altered. We're not going to have a 100-year-old cedar tree have it be replaced by another cedar tree, for example. However, if there was certain topography changes or terracing, that's certainly something that is going to impact the siting of a building. So maybe we wouldn't allow a hedge of acacias or some kind of large bushy tree, but it is pretty property specific. So we're going to make that determination on a site to site basis, but it hasn't necessarily come up or been challenged yet. That's a good question. Any others? Adriana?
I have a question about the easement that, the facade easement. What happens if there's an earthquake and that walls tumbling all down?
Mhm.
Okay. Does the property owner are they still able to get the higher, deduction? Do they get additional credit for consideration
Mhm.
if they have to replace that facade? I'm just curious how that would work. And also, have they considered the buildings that have this facade easement? If they don't have the mill back, why don't they get it?
So the first question was, what are the circumstances or what happens in the scenario of a disaster where a large portion of the structure that is protected is actually in jeopardy or has been damaged? And the second question that I'll get to was, if they don't have a Mills Act, why don't they, and can they be introduced into that program? So typically paragraph 9 of our easements does cover natural disasters and damage resulting from that. And the situation is spelled out in the requirements for an assessment within a certain period of time of the extent of the damage, what is damage, and what are some potential rehabilitation scenarios. If based on that report, a determination would be made of whether or not the basically historic integrity of that property was a complete loss, or if there was potential for rehab, and an agreement with the property owner that they would invest in actually bringing the property and structure back to historic National Register eligibility standards and condition. The period of time is often that's kind of the variable. Depends on the size of the property, if it's commercial or not. And we see that being discussed quite a bit in new easements, people's willingness or understanding of how vulnerable their property might be. It is also explained that if the property is chosen after a natural disaster damage to not be reconstructed, that the easement would be extinguished in that point. So it's not clear to me, that would be a very good tax lawyer question, is if that were to happen within a certain period of time of someone taking their income tax deduction, what would happen? Would it stop? Would it actually still carry out if the IRS places any limitations on that kind of overlap in time period? Hasn't happened, knock on wood. I'm hoping never to have that question, but it is spelled out in the easement language. What form of assessment is needed, the time period in which it has to be made, stabilization measures that are required, and the eventual assessment or evaluation of whether or not it can be reconstructed. Now, most property owners, if they have gotten as far as to even understand that easements are available and of interest to them, are usually pretty informed about all of the incentives that are available. That's been my experience thus far. In very rare cases, I think only one, the property changed hands. It was a young owner, so he came into the easement not realizing that the Mills Act existed, but learned quickly from the city of Pasadena that it was, and is now pursuing that. So it's because they are independent. One is through a nonprofit like ourselves, one is through the city. People don't always get the information at the same time. But usually if we are talking to a property owner and just explaining and introducing them to the nature of an easement and the process, that's something that we would mention to them because it's also just in their interest. But because they're not necessarily aligned or coming from the same sources, people are not always have the information at the same time. All right, we'll wrap it.